Thank you for joining us to Introduction to Child Labor in Agriculture. This webinar is being offered in English and Spanish. If you need the Spanish interpretation, please go down to where you see the globe icon and interpretation. Click on that and select Spanish. Now I have the pleasure of introducing our two presenters. First, we have Julie Taylor. Julie, give a wave if you can. She is the Executive Director of the National Farm Worker Ministry. Prior to leading NFWM, she spent many years working on hunger education and child and family advocacy. We also have Norma Flores Lopez. She grew up as a child of a migrant farm worker family in South Texas, and she started working at the fields at a young age. She serves as the Domestic Issues Committee Chair of Child Labor Coalition, and she is an award-winning advocate for child labor rights. All right, let's get started.
Well, it's a real pleasure to be with you this afternoon, and thanks so much that you've taken the time this morning or this afternoon, depending on what part of the world you're in. And I'm so glad to be sharing this time with Norma. So we want to just talk about children in agriculture and then explore their labor in our fields. So right now there's an estimated 300 to 500,000 child farm workers in the U.S. It's really hard to count because these are not numbers that are included in the Department of Labor statistics for agriculture. These are estimates of the number of children that are working in our fields. It's really hard to count them. They're typically not paid through the same channels as everybody else. They're often paid through their parents or off books. And so it's really hard to get a count for this, but this is an estimate by very knowledgeable allies in this work. And just so that you understand, the federal minimum age to work full-time in agriculture is just 12 years old. So what are some of the difficulties about children doing agricultural work? There's a serious lack of legal protections for them. 25 states do not have any limits on the amount of hours a child farm worker can work. 35 states allow children under 16 to work 7 days a week in agriculture. It makes one wonder where there is time or energy or physical strength even for school. Health and safety is a major issue for children. Agriculture is the most dangerous sector that U.S. children are allowed to work in. The fatality rate's 4 times higher than any other sector. Children are injured on farms every day, and a child dies in a farm-related accident once every 3 days in the U.S. Children's bodies and brains are still developing, so they're particularly vulnerable to the harmful effects of pesticides, heat-related illnesses, violent contact with animals, or even, sadly, other humans, the use of sharp tools, heavy machinery, and dangerous transportation vehicles. Specifically, in pesticide exposure, there was a Wake Forest survey of child farm workers in North Carolina that found that only 8% of participants received any pesticide training, even though according to North Carolina law, all farm workers are supposed to receive training, whether they apply pesticides or not, within a week of beginning work. According to experts, children are 3 times more vulnerable to pesticides than adults. And even if youth are not directly handling pesticides, they're still exposed when planting, weeding, thinning, pruning, harvesting, or processing crops that have already been sprayed. Immigration status is another challenge that children in agriculture face. The immigration status of a child, a parent, or the whole family frequently makes them more susceptible to exploitation. The immigration status can also be a barrier to accessing the community resources that farm worker families need. The immigration status of a child, parent, or even the whole family puts a lot of pressure on the family itself, so that they don't report difficulties as often, because they don't want to be identified as undocumented anyway and separated and have their family members deported. There's an educational impact too. Migrant students have one of the highest dropout rates in the United States. Many of the children who migrate with their families for farm work will change schools 2 to 3 times a year. Migrant students often have trouble making friends or even joining extracurricular activities because they're not enrolled for long enough in the academic year for them to be participants. What we do know is that when farm worker students are given proper support, they are able to succeed in school. So why are children working in agriculture? The primary reason is just simply the financial burden on their families. 25% of all farm workers have a family income below the poverty line. When parents make poverty wages, they need their children to work too, so that they can pay for necessary expenses. There are also language barriers. Many farm workers need their children in the fields to help translate instructions from supervisors. Many farm workers also lack childcare. They're not options for where children can be left safely. Many parents even bring their children to the fields, which exposes them even further to heat stress and pesticides, but they don't have anywhere to leave them, and so they have to do this. So those are just some basic sort of overarching pieces of information about children in agriculture. And I want to invite Norma now just to share with us a bit more from her personal experience and her knowledge as an advocate in child labor for many years. Norma?
Thank you so much, Julie. Hi, everyone. As mentioned, my name is Norma Flores Lopez. I grew up in South Texas, which is where I'm calling and where I'm joining y'all from now. I grew up in this area. This is the majority, where the majority of migrant farm worker families travel from. They go from South Texas and can travel to every one of the states, including we've had families that go to Hawaii, for example, or Washington State or Florida. And they go following the harvest in search of work to be able to provide for their families. That's something that my parents did and my grandparents did, something that I grew up doing myself too. We would pack up all of our belongings to the back of a pickup truck, and we would start the 2-day trip to be able to get up to states like Michigan, Iowa, Indiana, Colorado. And we did all kinds of harvests, everything from onions to apple orchards to detasseling corn. Like many farm workers that you hear about the stories of them as they started working out in the fields, I started at a very young age. As stated, I was able to legally start working in agriculture at the age of 12. But I had some earlier memories of working probably around the age of 9 for some of these reasons, where there wasn't affordable or reliable childcare that could accommodate my parents' work schedules. For people who work in agriculture, you start really early, oftentimes before the sun is up. And then you can, the work hours are very unpredictable, and sometimes it goes late into the night, and we're working by the light of the headlights from a car. And so my parents would bring us along with them because that was their best option, to be able to have them watch over me while I had them there close by. And our options were either to sit in a very hot car, which is not a very good or healthy option, or to be able to join them alongside out. It would often start as play, pick up these apples and see who could be able to pick it up the fastest and fill it up, or being able to take water to my parents. as you heard, especially with the piece rate, it's very easy to hide how many people are out there. And you're encouraged to be able to have as many hands as possible. And so any little bit of help that we were able to provide, even as a 9-year-old, was a help to my family. And so we'd be out there helping out as much as we could. And oftentimes we weren't aware of the dangers that were around us. Yes, there was the extreme weather conditions that could sometimes get really hot, especially during the summer and those long 10, 12-hour days that we would be out there. There would be the bugs, the snakes, the all kinds of, heavy machinery and sharp tools that would be surrounded by. But then there were also some of the unknown dangers. As shared many times, people that are working in agriculture don't even understand what sort of chemicals they're surrounded with. Each year, farms use billions of pounds of chemicals, including pesticides that are known to be to cause cancers, to be carcinogens, to be able to create some long-term health effects like Alzheimer's and Parkinson's that they've been linked to. So for us, when we were growing up, I didn't even know what a pesticide really was or the dangers around it until I was about 17 years old, when we got training by an advocacy group that was going out there and doing some health and safety training for us. Before that, they would tell us it was medicina para las plantas. So for us, medicine, we don't associate it with dangerous, with being able to have the potential to hurt us. And so we would go out there and try to rinse our hands off before we ate with some of the water, not knowing that it was laced with some dangerous chemicals for us. I was one of the kids that had to travel with my parents and sometimes went to 2 to 3 different schools each school year. Each state had a different system. Each time that I had to move, I had to relearn, where the lessons were at and try to catch up, and feeling out of place. When I would go and work during the summer breaks or even during the spring breaks or on the weekends, I would often come back to school and see that nobody else had that same experience as I did. Very few people did. They would ask me why I looked so tan if I was at the beach, if I was at the park, and I'd have to admit that I was out in the onion fields. And if it wasn't for my suntan that would give me away, it was definitely the smell of onions coming off of my hands. And there's nothing that a 12-year-old wants to smell less like than onions. And if those weren't enough signs to give me away, oftentimes my hands would be so swollen from those large scissors that I'd be using to cut the onions that I wouldn't even be able to hold a pencil. And so my mom would, with her broken Spanish, write a note to the teacher asking for, once again, to be able to make accommodations for me. Oftentimes students can pick up on those. Now looking back, I understand some of those frustrations that many educators would have at having to create new lesson plans or having to work, with the incoming student and trying to be able to find a place for them. Because many times our educators are overworked and don't understand about the migrant lifestyle, and don't even sometimes speak the language when I would be in the Midwest and going to schools where I was the only non-white child. But in those days as a child, I definitely felt like a burden. I felt out of place. I felt alone. And it's easy to see why children of farm worker families drop out the 4 times the national average, and don't even go on to, higher studies. It is because of that lack of education, the lack of opportunities. And many times some of these other factors that we talked about, like immigration status or language barriers or isolation, that you could see why these particular families are vulnerable to exploitation, and why there's very few opportunities to be able to being able to provide for their families, to get the appropriate income, to get a fair living wage. There's not a whole lot of opportunities for them. And so I want to highlight that, because what ends up happening is that desperate poverty is what continues to push those farm workers to be out there and leaves them very vulnerable to exploitation, especially young children. And this can happen to young girls who are especially vulnerable for, sexual assault, or even just sexual harassment. Many times when they're out there on their own, in isolated rural areas where there's this power dynamic where the grower or the contractor holds a lot of the power, they use that to be able to exploit and to take advantage of these young girls. And that's something that, I got to witness. Luckily, I didn't experience it myself because of the fact that I had my father out there, who was one of the people that was in charge. He kept a very close eye on us, but not everybody has that same opportunity where, their own father gets to look out for their kids. The fact that I was keenly aware that I was left alone because of my father says a lot, because that shows that so many other people, I already knew even then that that was a real danger for folks. And that's what we're trying to be able to keep from happening. The labor laws, the way they are written, have racist roots. And back in the day, it was a lot of Black children that were being left unprotected. Over the years, that has now become something that brown children, immigrant children, foreign children that are coming into the country, trying to be able to look for that American dream and looking for financial stability. Those are the ones that are now being taken advantage of through these loopholes in the child labor laws. When we go and talk about these particular bills and different ways to protect these children, how to equalize the child labor laws, the pushback that we often hear is that white children whose parents own the farm, who one day want to inherit the farm, that they will be limited in their opportunities, ignoring the fact that there are educational programs that will continue to be protected despite any child labor law changes. FFA, 4-H, any of those sort of programs do not get touched by child labor laws because they are educational programs. And those are ways to safely be able to ensure that the next generation of farmers are able to learn about the practices and be able to inherit that family farm. People like me, families like mine, families like those that are working today to be able to harvest the fruits and vegetables that we enjoy every day, will never have that opportunity because they don't have that access to capital. They don't have that access to land. Even though they might have the knowledge base to be able to grow their own fruits and vegetables and to run their own business, they have very limited opportunities to be able to access those opportunities that would allow them to have their own farm, their own operation, food production operation. They might be able to climb some of those steps, and it's very hard fought advancements that they make, but that's about as far. And so when you conflate the two, when you lead people to believe that the reason that we keep these child labor laws untouched, unregulated, and expose children to danger because one day they might be able to own their own farm and to continue this legacy of growing our fruits and vegetables here in our country, is false and puts a lot of children in danger, because there's a whole subgroup of children that look like me, that look like many of the children that maybe you guys serve through your programs or see come in through your congregations, that all that's happening is that we're cutting their opportunities to be able to grow up and have an education, all because we want cheap fruits and vegetables. And it's just artificially cheap, because in reality there's a real human cost behind it that we need to take into account, the exploitation and the dangers that these children are going through. And so with that in mind, there are bills that we're trying to be able to look at, and I know I'm getting myself ahead of myself here, but the reason I'm bringing it up is because I also want to underscore the fact that farm worker families do not have a lot of control out there in the fields. I have heard from families talking about how they pushed back and demanded that they get better wages because another farm was giving a higher price, and they wanted to stay in that operation, but they wanted to get paid what they earn, what they deserve. And what that grower told them was, no, I'm not going to raise the wages. If you want to go work in that farm, you guys can go over there because I'm firing you guys. And the following year went on to bring in H2A workers, because it's about control. It's about being able to limit people's options. And so I share that with you because oftentimes what you hear people push back to is, well, if I as a parent don't want my kid to work 10 hours, I'll just keep them from working that many hours. And the reality is, when you're out there working in the fields, you don't get to determine your own hours. You are at the mercy of what the plants need, at what the harvest needs. The growers will push you to be able to stay out there until everything that needs to be done is done, despite you pushing your body beyond your abilities. As a child, you want to do well, you want to keep up. And oftentimes I would push myself beyond my own physical abilities and put myself at risk of dehydration, of heat exhaustion, of being able to take on tasks that I know that I couldn't, lifting things that were too heavy for me. But I want to keep up and do a good job so I can help out my parents, because I also know how much is on the line for them. And if we didn't do a good job, if we put any limits, if we pushed back, we would simply be blacklisted. And the following year, we wouldn't be asked to come back to work. And that would be financially disastrous for my family. There was a year that my parents decided to cut short the season in order for us to be able to not miss as much school, to not start as late. And I know for years that it took them literally years to be able to recover from that decision. It was a huge sacrifice on their part, but it's because so much is tied around being able to work hard and long hours and put away as much money as possible during those summer months, that if you cut any of that short, or if you miss out on an entire season, the family really struggles to be able to catch back up. Luckily for me and my family, I was US born, my parents are US born. It didn't do anything to change our work conditions or how we were treated, or our lack of self-determination while we were out there in the fields, and to set our own schedule. But it did help us be able to access certain aid that's provided to people who are here in the US legally. For those that are undocumented, oftentimes they're denied even basic aid because they don't have the proper documentation. And so these families are even more vulnerable and desperate to be able to put food on their tables and that of their families. And back to the issue of self-determination, oftentimes when we're dependent on the grower of being able to provide us, even with the housing, everybody that's of age is expected to be able to go out there and work. So even as a 12-year-old, as a 13-year-old, because I'm legally able to work, that was the expectation. My parents couldn't live in migrant housing and say, I don't want my children to work until they're 16, but we will go work. That wasn't an option. Everybody who was legally able to work needed to be out there every day. Even if we were sick, we would push ourselves to be out there because we knew what it meant to lose a day's worth of wages for our family. We needed to put food on the table. We needed to keep the lights on. And even as a young child, I was very much keenly aware of those necessities and why I pushed myself beyond. The only way that I was able to get out, as I mentioned, is thanks to programs like Head Start, Migrant Ed, thanks to clinics that offered us healthcare when we would go up north. Some of those migrant clinics that were out there available. That's how my mom was able to catch her cancer and was able to get treated and was able to afford that. And was able to survive, and now she's here today. That's how my father was able to get his diabetes diagnosed, his type 1 diabetes as an adult, and being able to get a plan to be able to, take care of himself and stay here with us today. It was thanks to those sort of programs that helped us be able to find the resources that we needed to be able to survive as a family. And, through the migrant ed programs, and then later on through other programs that helped me into my college years, I was able to graduate not only from an undergrad program and get my bachelor's, but go on to get my master's program as well in public policy. And since then, now I've dedicated a career to being able to, share my experiences, to talk about what it's like, what it truly is like, and also how unfair the child labor laws are in this country, how far behind we are from other countries on the international stage, and how we can do better. And it is our imperative to do better, to be able to help others out. So I appreciate you guys taking a few moments to be able to hear my story. And I'm excited to be able to work with some of y'all and how we are able to push forward to change that for other people.
Thank you, Norma. That's great. Yes. I appreciate all your personal reflections. While you were talking, I was thinking about a story that Rose and I heard when we were in the Northwest last summer, which was a young man who didn't feel well. And so he went to his supervisor to say that he wanted to go home. And the supervisor said, yes, you can go home, but if you do, leave your work papers and the work papers of your whole family, because you won't be able to come back here if you leave. And so he had the pressure of just his own body not feeling well and wanting to go home and wanting some rest, but then added pressure of that determining what would happen to his whole family's livelihood. So those stories just bring those things home to us more and more. And they're things that we don't see and we don't hear very much. So thank you very much for sharing all that you did. So we've had kind of an overview, and we've heard Norma talk a lot about, I mean, just sort of making the point of all the things that we talked about. But we want to turn our attention towards, so what can we do about it? Because that's why, at least the National Farm Worker Ministry, that's why we exist. That's Norma's following a calling, you could say, right, in your life. So what can we do about that? And so we wanted to take a moment to look at legislation and actions that you could take. And so one of the things that we promoted when we first started looking at child labor last fall was the CARE Act. And so, Norma, I'm going to ask you to speak to that specific piece of legislation. You've already shared some really good points with us about some of the pushback that there are, not just with that one, but with a lot of child labor issues. But would you share specifically a bit about the Children's Act for Responsible Employment? It's shortened to CARE, but would you share about that?
Absolutely. The CARE Act is a bill that has been introduced at every session since about 2009. Representative Lucy Roba Allard, who has since now retired, was one of our big champions on this particular bill. And what it does is it's very simple. All it says is that loophole that says that there's a cutout for a different set of rules for children working in agriculture. We're going to eliminate that. We're going to make sure that all children in every industry have the same protections, the same way that we can't have a 12-year-old making copies or cleaning floors in an office building. We shouldn't have that same 12-year-old working in one of the most dangerous industries, being exposed to dangers like pesticides, heat exposure, sexual assault, sharp tools, heavy machinery, any of those sort of things. We need to make sure that all children are being protected equally. And so essentially what that does is just eliminates that subset of rules for children working in agriculture. You would need to be 16 years old to be able to hold employment, and you would need to be 18 years old to be able to do dangerous work. And what it does is it also requires for people who have children working on farms to be able to report those injuries that happen and increase some of the fines. What we see that oftentimes happens is growers are willing to be able to put the risk on the workers because the chances of them getting caught, of them violating child labor laws or even safety laws are minimal, and even less for them to have to actually pay the fines that are being set out there. So we're making sure that there's a stronger enforcement, because we know that rules are only as good as they're being enforced. And so we're making sure that there's a reporting mechanism there too, so we understand which are the most dangerous types of jobs that children are doing. And all of this at the end is to make sure that children are able to do jobs that are safe, jobs that are age appropriate and within limits of hours. It's unconscionable that we're going to be allowing for children to work an unlimited amount of hours outside of school, which is what the current federal law allows for children to work beyond the 40 hours a week, to be able, as I did, 70, 80 hours a week, 10 to 12-hour days, oftentimes without any days off during the summer, because that's what the harvest requires. And what we're saying is we don't have any other children doing that. So we can't have children in agriculture doing that as well. And so we hope that we could be able to get support to get that passed through. We have new co-sponsors that are willing to take on this issue and continue to push forward. But as we've mentioned, it's just a reluctance to do any limitations on any type of farm practices and work. And that's really the only thing that's keeping the CARE Act from being able to move forward.
Okay. And then can you say, has this bill been introduced in this new Congress or not quite yet?
Not quite yet. We have the people lined up for it, and we're getting that ready to be able to get that introduced. We're hoping in the next couple of months to be able to have a bill to be able to be introduced. There are other bills that would do similar things, like to be able to keep children from working on tobacco. That's another bill that we've been working on that has been introduced, but in this one in particular, because Roba Allard has retired late last year, now we're starting over.
Right. Well, and I think since we're in a new Congress, a lot of the bills that we've supported in the past, there's intention to reintroduce them, but they don't all get reintroduced at the very beginning. There's sort of some strategy around that. And so we'll look forward to hearing about that through the Child Labor Coalition, and we'll be announcing that as well, because we want folks to be able to support that. Do you want to say a little bit about the I mean, you don't need to say very much necessarily, but about the getting children out of tobacco. Do you want to say a little bit about that and why that I'm in North Carolina, so I know about this, but you want to say a little bit about that?
Absolutely. So as we were talking about the different sort of areas and the type of tasks that are particularly dangerous, back in 2012, we tried to be able to push for there to be stronger protections for the most hazardous jobs that exist that children are allowed to do. In agriculture, you can start doing hazardous work at the age of 16, where in every other industry, you have to be 18 years old, you have to be an adult. And so this list of the jobs that would be limited to 16-year-old and up, to not allow anybody under 16 to do, that particular list needed to be updated. And among those jobs was working in tobacco because of the nicotine exposure that exists for those that are harvesting tobacco. Those rules were rescinded under the Obama administration, and no changes were made. So we have a list that we know is dangerous of work, and unfortunately, we're not doing anything as a country about it. So what we've been focusing on is tobacco in particular. Not only does it have all of the other dangers that agricultural work has, but then, as I mentioned, there's that nicotine exposure that gives children green tobacco sickness, which can put them in danger of dehydration, makes them addicted to the nicotine. They're exposed to as many as 36 cigarettes, the equivalent of 36 cigarettes through their skin that's absorbed. Because as we've mentioned, the children are not little adults. They have much more exposure. They're much more vulnerable. Their body will absorb that nicotine, and it'll make those children very sick. Some workers have even been advised to take up smoking so that they don't feel it as much when they're out there working in agriculture. So tobacco in particular is one of those that we feel is particularly dangerous. So there is a bill that has been also introduced in the past, and we plan to continue to do that, that would say that children are not allowed to do any tobacco jobs because of all of the dangers that come with it.
Mm-hmm. So thank you for sharing that. Tobacco is a big product here in North Carolina, and we know from the adult farm workers who come into North Carolina, they anticipate that the first week to 2 weeks they'll feel nauseous, that their body just has to adjust to the exposure to nicotine. So I can imagine that for children, that's exponentially a greater impact on their physical bodies. So thanks for telling us about that. Some of the other legislation that we as an organization have pushed overall, not just for children, but children would fall under these umbrellas. One is the Asuncion Valdivia Heat Illness and Fatality Prevention Act, which basically would provide heat stress regulations for the entire country. There are some heat stress regulations in place in California. And several years ago, when there was such a heat wave in the Northwest, both Washington State and Oregon enacted emergency heat stress regulations. But this needs to be federal legislation, because there's no such thing in places like Florida or Texas or Arizona, places who typically have high temperature and also are agricultural states. And so we want to get OSHA to create those standards, and this law would require them to do so. OSHA right now is currently working on regulations, but it's a pretty long process, maybe as much as 7 years to take place, and it can be rescinded depending on which administration happens to be in power at the moment. So we want to see a law passed that would provide heat stress regulations to guarantee shade, hydration, and rest, periods of rest for people. The other one we have worked on is the Protect America's Children from Toxic Pesticides Act, and then a more focused bill called Ban Organophosphates Act. We've been working with Alianza Nacional de Campesinos and Earth Justice on setting up delegations to talk to legislators about banning organophosphates. So these are pesticides that specifically act on the neurological systems of children. They can cause developmental delays and things like that. And so we just want to see them completely banned. The Protect America's Children from Toxic Pesticides Act is far more comprehensive. It deals with a lot more different kinds of pesticides for the exposures and the ways that they interact with people. And so both of these, for us to be providing as safe an environment under the circumstances as we can, is important to us. And so the other one is Fairness for Farm Workers Act. This has basically been unofficially called the Overtime Bill for Farm Workers. It's an important bill, and yet it's a challenging bill. So because the labor laws in the U.S. have excluded farm workers for a long time, farm workers can work 12 hours a day, 7 days a week, and they make the same thing at the 60th or 70th hour that they make in the first hour, in general, as a federal situation. And so Fairness for Farm Workers Act was introduced so that after 40 hours, farm workers like other employees could make a higher rate for those additional hours that they work. Now, there's been some states who have enacted this on a state basis. And I have to tell you, while we continue to support Fairness for Farm Workers Act because we believe farm workers deserve this, the challenge has been that the industry has found ways to work around that. And that's always the case, I think, when you try to put in place regulations or things that a lot of times to save money, people find workarounds. One of the workarounds has been in states like California or New York, where this has been enacted and has phased itself in. A lot of employers, growers, farmers, people who own the land and pay farm workers to work there, what they've done is limit farm workers to 40 hours a week and then hire additional farm workers to work the extra hours that before an individual farm worker would do. So it saves them so that they don't have to pay more for those extra hours. What's sad about it is farm workers who have grown accustomed to working the extra hours and were hoping for the additional income it would bring to them have found themselves limited to 40 hours a week, and so making less now than they made before. So somewhere in the system, we have to find something that will benefit and be similar to the ways in which other workers in this country are treated without causing this kind of a workaround. I don't know exactly how that will happen, but we continue to make this a point of conversation with legislators and the wider public, just so that we're aware that this is a reality. All these four pieces of legislation, as far as I know of right now, have not been reintroduced in the new Congress, but there is intentionality about the possibility that they will be. Norma, is there more you'd like to say about any of these, or are there other pieces of legislation that you would like to share with us?
In regards to legislation, no. I think that there is a lot of opportunity with this particular administration to being able to update some of the labor laws, or even some of the regulations and protections around farm workers, but even women in general, to be able to help being able to strengthen protections around them. In particular, equal pay, I think, is really important, that people recognize the vulnerability of living in poverty. Oftentimes that's the pushback that we get is, well, if you pull the kids out of the fields and their families will not be able to eat. And what we've said from the beginning is that this is something that needs to be done in conjunction with some of the other pieces as well, including a fair living wage. You can't expect farm workers to be able to survive, and that's why they lean on their children, because they are paid under a fair living wage. And I think that's an important component to it. But also in things like, as I mentioned, enforcement is incredibly important to make sure that there are enough inspectors that are out there, that there's enough education that's happening so workers understand not only their rights, but also some of the dangers that they're facing. And so I think that we could do a whole lot more to being able to push this administration even when it comes to immigration and how they are currently treating many of those folks that are coming in and pushing them further into the margins. Those are things that impact them and their vulnerability out in the working in the fields. Because again, a lot of these bills are only as good as they're going to be enforced and as good as the workers are actually going to be informed about it. And without the ability to have a self-determination, which is oftentimes tied with the financial stability or with the immigration status, a pathway to citizenship, it's really difficult to be able to lift those farm workers and their families out of poverty. But it goes back to, it needs to be a much more holistic approach and understanding that you can't just pull the kids out of the fields, but there also has to be funding and investment in programs like Head Start and Migrant Ed. There has to be also a fair living wage and pushing for that. There has to be a lot of other pieces like a pathway to citizenship in order for this to work.
Thank you. And Rose, I think, will speak to the supporting migrant education program state by state.
Yeah, Norma just mentioned that about how it's a multifaceted, this child labor is a multifaceted issue. And so we really do have to address so many of the components that are hit by child labor. And one of those is supporting the migrant education program and making sure that as there are budget cuts, that, you know, migrant education program isn't one of the ones on the chopping block. So what the migrant education program does is it just helps students that are moving from state to state or possibly from district to district within a state, depending on how they're following the harvest. And this is agricultural in general as well. So the migrant education program could be for people who are doing migratory fishing or not just you know, field work per se, but it's making sure that they're able to meet those challenging academic standards that all children are asked to meet. So it's services, academic services, but then it's also academic services that are specialized to their needs, being migratory students. And it's also social services as well. So what we recommend you do is go to the migrant education program, look at your state and see who's the coordinator. And then once you go into your state, you can see based on your region, who's your regional coordinator. And you can find out, you know, does my school district have this? What kind of services are available to them? You might even see, are they looking for volunteers? Are they looking for, you know, resources that that they need? If you see that it doesn't look like that there is migrant education program, but you can't see what kind of services are being offered, then ask for that information, and make sure that those kids are getting what they need. Because it really is based on how parents identify, and then also recruiting families as well. As Norma mentioned, many times she was in the Midwest, so sometimes parents don't know this exists. So it's also about just connecting the two, that they know that this is a service for their kid. We will go into a Q&A now. We do have quite a few questions, but I really just wanted to encourage everyone to learn more and raise awareness. That's one of the most effective ways that you can take action. We have a video where we have children speaking about their own experiences, and we talk about these actions as well within the video. And then we have a lot of downloadables about child labor and agriculture, but then we also have a lot of downloadables about a variety of issues that impact farm workers, from pesticides to heat to immigration. So please visit our website and share those resources. So going
Rose?
in,
Just before you do the question and answer, I just wondered if Jessica Cully might be on the call and want to share a bit, or if some of the farm worker students from Kata in New Jersey might be present. And maybe they could identify themselves to you and share if they're here. And if not, yes, definitely let's look at questions.
Anyone from Kata? All right. And we will be sharing all of these links in our recording email, follow-up email. So you'll get all of that. I know, you can't click on the, the slide, so I know that's hard. And we have a lot of links that we want you to be able to look at. We try to have all of the legislation in one page, so you don't have to necessarily worry about all of these different links to all the different legislation. Let's see. What can we do to stop these types of pesticides and get real EPA rules? I know that's kind of addressed by two of the legislation pieces that we are asking people to support, but do either of you want to go into either of that?
Well, I'll just say on behalf of National Farm Worker Ministry, we've joined the Farm Worker Association of Florida, who's been one of the more outspoken farm worker organizing groups in relation to pesticides in general for many years. And Farm Worker Justice, it's an advocacy ally in Washington, D.C. The United Farm Workers Union and their work on chlorpyrifos over the years. And currently we're working with Alianza on specifically banning organophosphates. So it's been several different directions that we've gone. In some cases, there have been proposals of legislation, trying to get legislation through, educating the wider public, but also getting allies and advocates and farm workers together to make legislative visits, or in the last few years, because of the pandemic, those have been virtual meetings. But to look for co-sponsorship, to do education in conversation, and to try to move those things forward. It's not unusual as administrations change for us to connect with our farm worker partners and other allies to sign letters of support to the regulatory bodies like the Environmental Protection Agency or OSHA, the Occupational Safety Health Administration, and to connect with the Department of Health and Human Services about exposures that farm workers have, as well as their access to services that will help them mitigate the difficulties of pesticides. It is slow work, but we're always looking for advocates. I would encourage you to sign up for our e-news when our farm workers, and if you can follow us on social media, our farm workers put out opportunities like that, and we share them more broadly in an effort to build sort of coalition around that kind of work. But we look primarily to laws and regulations, and then honestly encourage investigative reporting. If you are a witness in your own community of farm workers exposure, then we would urge you to write a letter to the editor of your local paper to make the wider public more aware of that taking place in your own community.
The next question, Norma kind of already answered, but how effective is regulation that just increases the minimum age to work? And she already hit on the fact that yes, we need that legislation, but we also need all of these other pieces of legislation. We also need all of this other work that we are asking you to do and follow up on. And that we really do have to address all of these different areas to help solve this issue, to help reduce child labor in agriculture. And I'll also encourage you, on our website, we have our different farm worker partners, because I know some people asked what organizations we're working with. We have a list there. And sometimes regionally as well, they might be working on doing something for childcare or something else that their families in that area have said that they need assistance with. So we encourage you to look there as well. These actions are coming from our farm worker partners and allies. I don't know, Norma, did you want to add anything to that? Or was that concise enough? And then the next one, will you let us know when these bills are introduced into Congress? Please follow us and follow Child Labor Coalition. The last slide will have all our social media links, and that is the best way for us to share that information. We'll let you know when they're reintroduced, but we'll also let you know that we're looking, or they are looking for more co-sponsors. So please reach out to your legislators asking them to co-sponsor, or we'll give you more specific steps along the way of what we need to do now to push this bill forward, these various bills forward. Can we have a multi-approach in the industry with the EPA, with education, and with Congress? Which way is best?
I think what I will share from having been working on this for, I won't say how many years, but a lot of years. Since I was a teenager, they did ask me to start sharing my personal story and then building on that with some of these policies. As anybody who's worked in DC will be able to attest to, it's a long process. Being able to get folks to be able to jump on board. We are pushing on all those different fronts, and which is why we encourage you to follow along with the Child Labor Coalition. We have regulatory proposals, we have reports that we're trying to push out. We're trying to be able to talk to private companies and ask them to be able to agree to voluntary standards. And we're also pushing and talking to members of Congress and looking at all the different ways that we can be able to better support. We talk to folks about the appropriations process as well, to make sure that they support all the different programs that are needed to reduce child labor and to better support farm worker families. So we're looking at it from all the different angles. Really what it comes down to is the saying that the squeaky wheel gets the oil. And so it's really important that we share information, that we talk to other people about this particular issue. A lot of folks don't even know that this exists, that this happens. They think of child labor as an issue that happens in third world countries, something abroad, but not understanding that this is happening here in our own backyards, in our own food supply, in our communities, that many of these children are being exposed to all of these different dangers and don't have those protections. And so just by even sharing those stories, I think it's really important. It's the first step. When we go to a farmer's market, asking how are these fruits and vegetables getting produced? Oftentimes companies will respond to what the customer is asking, what the consumer needs. And so if we're asking for things that are fairly sourced, that are humanely sourced, that's going to give them that push to be able to agree to that. And then our members of Congress too, they decide what they're going to push for and ask for based on those emails, those phone calls, those petitions that they hear from their constituents. And so all of those are going to be really important if we want to be able to see this multifaceted, comprehensive approach. Then that is up to us as a community of advocates to be able to come at it from every angle and to make sure that we're talking about this with folks across the different agencies and offices and walks of life, that they all understand that we all have a responsibility in this, and that we all put our faith into action, and that we take all the different steps. And again, you can learn about all the different ways of getting involved and learning about these reports and information through the Child Labor Coalition, and also through NFWM as well. And all of us are working in conjunction with each other, and you'll be able to see these different reports to share out, and different fact sheets and other information you could share with folks.
Sorry, I had myself muted still. two other quick questions. One I think is going to be too massive for us to get to, but hopefully we can maybe address it within the follow-up email. Someone asked in the video that we have right there about child labor and agriculture. It features some young people who are wanting to go to college. Do we have an update on them, and did they get to go to college? So the young man who you do see in that still, he is getting ready to graduate with an engineering degree. And he's been doing advocacy work. You'll see another young woman in the video. Her name is Silvana. She recently applied and put out her her video for admission. So I haven't heard back yet, but I'm sure she has gotten accepted because she's marvelous, so she should. And the other young woman, yes, as well. She has gotten to go to college. The other question that I said we'll try to address later is who actively opposes this legislation and what are their reasons? And I think the list is pretty long, so that's why maybe we can try to follow that up in an email.
Mhm.
All right, Julie, if you want to close us out.
Yeah, well, just to say to people, help us by continuing to talk about this. I think for us to keep this, you can say stirred up or whatever, and also you can say, which National Farm Worker Ministry and Child Labor Coalition often say is, we're still here, we're not going away. This is not at the top of the list of what everybody's working on, and yet it is at the top of our list, and we're gonna keep working on this as we go forward. There's nothing like persistence. So thank you for helping us do that. And so, so just a final thought is that for the farm worker families who bear the exploitation of our country's agricultural system and their children who must work in the fields to help their parents survive, we pray to the Lord. Lord, hear our prayer. And so we're grateful that you're here with us. Please connect with us. We've put the contacts both for National Farm Worker Ministry and the Child Labor Coalition from our social media. But there are lots of great resources that the Child Labor Coalition has on their website and continues to produce on a regular basis. And we do the same thing. And I hope that you can join us for future webinars. Thank you, Norma, for being part of this today. Thank you, Rose, for guiding us through this. And our interpreter, Maria, and our logistics person, Megan. Thanks, everybody.
Yes, thank you so much. Don't forget to follow us on social media.